there are more abortions after Dobbs. And I got to tell you, I'm surprised by how many more abortions there are. Like I'm super shocked actually. I mean, I've gotten over it. I've certainly, we've been watching it for a couple of years, I guess. But the last year before Dobbs, for which we have really good data that isn't potentially confounded by a pandemic, is a while ago. We've got data from like 2017 and we've got some data from 2019. So, Dobbs is in 2022. But around then, we were looking at around 800 to maybe 900,000 abortions in the US in a year. We now have recent data for 2024. I'll cite the Guttmacher Institute's data, that there were about 1.1 million abortions in 2024. Like, they're going up, and they're going up despite the fact that right now 12 states are enforcing near total bans. 4 states are enforcing very strict 6-week gestational age bans. 3 other states are enforcing 12 to 18-week gestational age bans. Like, all of these restrictions have taken place, and more people are getting abortions.
Bev, did you take an economics course in college?
I did not.
Neither did I. Seems like an oversight.
Yeah, no, I had, it didn't even cross my mind.
Today's guest is an economist.
She is. Professor Caitlin Myers from Middlebury College is joining us today, and she's freaking brilliant.
Yep. Well, I first became introduced to her work through this dashboard that she made that showed how far people had to travel for abortions across the country. And it's, first of all, a really beautiful map, which I'm sure you love.
I love maps.
Yeah. But also combines multiple sources of data to understand, like at the county level, how far someone would have to travel to have an abortion. And then after Dobbs, to understand how much that changed for this huge swath of the country. So it's a really powerful visual demonstration of the impact of abortion bans.
And she's going to explain how she studies the impact of policy on health, specifically related to abortion care. So we're excited to bring you this conversation with Caitlin Myers, and we'll have information about her dashboard in the show notes.
My name is Caitlin Myers, and I am an economist at Middlebury College in Vermont. More specifically, I'm an applied microeconomist. I would say that we're pretty focused on this question of when you want to use the scientific method to answer a question, but you can't run a controlled experiment, what do you do next? And that is my field. Also, I'll just add, I'm always curious about who people are beyond their business card. I'm a mom of 4, and I live in Vermont now, and I've lived here for 20 years, but I am originally from states, all the states that I lived in before this have banned abortion, or at least have a 6-week gestational age ban. So I am originally from Louisiana, Texas, rural West Virginia, and small town Georgia.
That is impressive, both that you have 4 kids and that you've lived in so many places.
How did you, when you were anticipating, I assume, your PhD or even as an undergraduate, did you know that you wanted to apply this to reproductive health, or when did that come about?
No, I didn't even know I wanted a PhD. So I'll say, I grew up in circumstances where going to college wasn't a foregone conclusion. So, it felt like a really big deal to go to college. And when I graduated from college, I honestly and sincerely had the life goal of having a stable salary and health insurance. And I had a big party when I graduated from college. And maybe I drank too much, because I then burned all of my economics notes and said that I would never be doing that again now that I was out in the world. And I went off to Texas, and I got a job making spreadsheets for engineers. And I realized within weeks that I'd made a terrible mistake. And that while I am very good at making spreadsheets, I have what economists would call perhaps an absolute advantage. Like in any room, I'm good at it. But I don't think I have a comparative advantage. I think my trade-offs are pretty significant in making them. I just didn't like it. It just didn't engage me. And so I had this crisis of realizing that for me to be happy in life, I was going to have to be asking my own questions and pursuing my own intellectual curiosity, that I really wanted that autonomy. And so I scurried back to grad school. I only applied to one school. I was living in Austin, Texas. My late husband, who I was married to at the time, was a native Texan. He didn't want to leave. So we made a deal. I would apply to one school in Texas. And if I got in, we would stay for grad school. And then he would go wherever I wanted. And if I didn't, I'd apply to a bunch of places the next year. And so I got into UT Austin, the economics program. And to be honest, I was really just doing it because I knew I didn't want to make spreadsheets for engineers, not because I knew I was particularly passionate about economics. And it wasn't until the end of my first year of graduate school of coursework that I took an advanced statistics class. And it was like angels were singing, because all of those questions that I had that were really motivating me, including questions about gender in the economy, race in the economy, that I didn't want to assume answers to, that I didn't want to just say, oh, women earn 80 cents on the dollar for what men earn. It's discrimination. I actually wanted to say, why? Is it discrimination? How do we know? What else could it be? I realized that there were these statistical methods that I could use to answer those questions. And it was actually a year into grad school that I got very excited about being an economist and being in grad school. But shortly after graduate school, I was working on a historical topic. I was really interested in what the hell happened in the 1960s and 70s. It is a period of just epical social change, right? Like it is rare in human history, time or space, that you can see such a small period of time in which there's such dramatic changes in people's roles in society. And if you think about men and women, like all of a sudden there's this real surge of women entering college, getting graduate degrees, entering professions that they weren't getting before. Men and women are delaying marriage, they're delaying having children. And there's this question of why? What sparked that? I became really interested in the role that increased reproductive autonomy might have had in some of those shifts. We have the introduction and FDA approval of the contraceptive pill in 1960 is when they approved it. And then we have the liberalization of abortion policy. And I started working on that question. I reached the conclusion that it was the liberalization of abortion policy that had really played a very substantial role in some of these shifts in childbearing patterns, marriage patterns. And then I basically said, man, if abortion policy was this important in the 60s and primarily the 70s, is it still important? And I started asking questions about the present, and I just haven't run out of them, basically.
How do you even ask that question? I mean, how do you isolate the effect of abortion policy on, I don't know, whatever your outcome is in those studies?
Yeah. So here's where we get to talk about natural experiments more. So ideally, what I would really like is a time machine and/or our alternate universe generator. And maybe those are the same things. I'm not a physicist. But what I would super like is to be able to just randomly assign, let's say, the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. And as long as I can randomly assign it, I'll do so like a couple million times, split all my universes, and then measure outcomes in the universes where Roe v. Wade basically granted a constitutional right to abortion that invalidated and overturned state bans, and another universe where that didn't happen and the bans continued for at least a while, right? Now, that would be a great controlled experiment. And I think, for y'all as physicians, like you're probably very used to thinking about controlled experiments. Like y'all have randomized controlled trials for drugs, for procedures, for medical devices. And I am very jealous because they are the gold standard for very good reason. And that is what you want to do if you can. But with Roe v. Wade, like here's this huge social question. I'm dwelling in the world of social questions, and I don't have a time machine or a universe splitter, and I can't randomize Roe. And even if I could randomize Roe, perhaps it wouldn't be ethical to do that to people. And so I'm stuck needing to look for something else. And what we look for in the social sciences is what we call a natural experiment, a situation where we as the researcher did not randomize what we call a treatment, the intervention, the shock, like abortion legalization. We didn't do that. Like I did not decide Roe v. Wade, right? But we have circumstances that we argue as good as randomly assigned it for us. So in the case of Roe, the natural experiment that people have used is the fact that some states had begun legalizing abortion before 1973. So if you go back to the 60s, states were updating their abortion regulations. Some of them were reforming them to allow some more circumstances, for instance, to preserve the health of the pregnant person under which abortion could be granted. But it turns out what was really key was that 5 states and DC basically repealed their abortion bans and legalized abortion before Roe. And so what we do is we compare how the outcomes trended in those states that were the early legalizers to the rest of the country, so that we argue we've got this shock. Like, look, here's what we see. Births suddenly go down. They go down quite sharply in the early legalizers, and they're not going down that sharply in the rest of the country. Then Roe happens, and what you can see is the rest of the country experiences a decline in births, and the early legalizers don't have that break. And so it's by comparing those trends, that's a method called difference in differences. It's by comparing those trends that we infer the causal effect. And in the case of abortion legalization, there's broad consensus that we know it had dramatic effects on American fertility. And so you can imagine if there is this expansion in abortion access, this expansion in reproductive autonomy, and we can see huge effects on fertility and marriage outcomes. I've, for instance, estimated that the legalization of abortion resulted in about a 30% decline in the fraction of women who became teen moms. Like, these are big effects. So then we look at the downstream effects. Did it affect their educational attainment? Did it affect the probability that they lived in poverty? Did it affect their labor force attachment? Did it affect how many children they ultimately had in their lives? So there are many economists working in this field, I'm not unique, who have looked at those downstream effects. And long story short, I think they're pretty much in line, in keeping with what you would expect. So economists have shown huge decreases in maternal mortality because of abortion legalization, particularly for Black women, large increases in college attainment, particularly for Black women, decreases in poverty, increases in labor force participation. So when the Supreme Court granted cert to Dobbs, meaning the Supreme Court agreed to take it up, I erroneously initially thought that the primary questions the court would be considering was whether there's a right to privacy established by the Constitution that extends to the right to choose abortion. Like, I thought that would be the question. And it was in part, right? But what I didn't understand was that because the Supreme Court has this principle of stare decisis, not wanting to overturn its own past decisions, that a second very primary question that it would consider in Dobbs is whether there was societal reliance on abortion. And in that case, there were a bunch of briefs submitted to the Supreme Court, and some briefs that were submitted in support of the state of Mississippi basically said, look, well, they actually said something contradictory. They said, 1, we have no way to know the causal effects of abortion legalization. And 2, we know there were no causal effects of abortion legalization. And those things are contradictory. Like, you got to pick one. But in any event, if you pick either of those, they're wrong. Like, we know, we have really good evidence. But then they also hedge their bets. So even in the same brief, they would say, even if you want to believe that there was an effective abortion legalization, that was 50 years ago. So much has changed. We've had expansions of anti-discrimination laws, anti-pregnancy discrimination laws, expansions of paid leave policy, expansions of health insurance access, expansions in access to contraception. Like, it's not the 1960s and 1970s anymore. Basically, abortion policy might have mattered once, but the argument would be, look, now, essentially, women can just effortlessly balance their fertility with the rest of their economic lives, no problem. Like, that's, and it's just, I mean, I get the argument that the evidence I just described is old. It is, but like, oh my gosh, it's not like we stopped studying it since then. There is a robust literature that has continued to study these questions ever since. So after the Roe decision, we have a whole lot more natural experiments. It's not like the landscape of abortion access was just static for 50 years. What we have is a situation where states immediately started to push and try to figure out what the limits of their powers might be following Roe. This resulted in a kind of like a very predictable series of events that would happen in a state that might be seeking to regulate abortion. So a state would pass a new regulation, like a law requiring minors show they've gotten the consent of a parent. Then somebody in that state, like abortion providers, would challenge the new law. Then it would go to a district court. Then it would go to an appellate court. Then eventually some of them make it to the Supreme Court. And so for decades, we have this series of events that really are still a state laboratory, right? We still have all these state experiments. We have states passing mandatory waiting periods, states restricting or granting Medicaid coverage for abortion, states that are passing parental involvement laws, states that are enacting what many advocates for abortion rights call trap laws, targeted regulation of abortion providers that are shutting down facilities and shocking distance. And we've studied all of those. Like, we have kept studying what happens when abortion access gets shocked. And the short answer, and I'm happy to dive into any specifics, you feel free to direct me, but like, here's the short answer is like, yeah, it still matters, right? Like it all still matters. And in fact, really all that's changed is that increasingly it is the case that these regulations most affect a particularly vulnerable group of society. Increasingly what we see since the Roe era, and this was true then too, don't get me wrong, but what we see is that, look, if you close the nearest provider, people with means, people like me, like I'm a college professor, if my daughter needed an abortion and the only one available was in Sweden, I would get her there tomorrow. We've got passports and we've got enough money. The people who don't manage to make it out are this wide swath of Americans who don't have the resources to travel to avoid the policies. And so what we see is that those are the populations that really get affected by the policies. That's what we see in the data.
And now we have this huge natural experiment of Dobbs and how that's impacting people. And I think, people thought, okay, well, Dobbs will mean there will be less abortions. So I guess that's our first question about Dobbs. Are there less abortions after Dobbs?
There are more abortions after Dobbs. And I got to tell you, I'm surprised by how many more abortions there are. Like I'm super shocked, actually. I mean, I've gotten over it. I've certainly, we've been watching it for a couple of years, I guess. But the last year before Dobbs, for which we have really good data that isn't potentially confounded by a pandemic, is a while ago. We've got data from like 2017 and we've got some data from 2019. So, Dobbs is in 2022. But around then, we were looking at around 800 to maybe 900,000 abortions in the US in a year. We now have recent data for 2024. I'll cite the Guttmacher Institute's data, that there were about 1.1 million abortions in 2024. Like, they're going up, and they're going up despite the fact that right now 12 states are enforcing near total bans. 4 states are enforcing very strict 6-week gestational age bans. 3 other states are enforcing 12 to 18-week gestational age bans. Like, all of these restrictions have taken place, and more people are getting abortions.
So I'm curious, I've heard a lot of people talk about why they think the number is going up post-Dobbs. I'm curious in how you've reflected on the data. Why do you think that number has increased?
Yeah, I can tell you why. And I just want to warn you, my opinion is backed by all available evidence, but it is really hard to count abortions, and we will never be able to fully answer this question of why. But I think we've got a pretty good idea. So what we can see in the data, first of all, is that the national surge in abortions is primarily driven by large increases in abortions to people living in states that didn't ban abortion. Places like New York, places like California, big populations. Not only did they not ban abortion after Dobbs, but abortion access actually expanded in those states through a variety of mechanisms. But one that I would really point to is that, first of all, more providers became more visible. They were more visibly advertising services. Abortion funds had a huge influx of donations right after Dobbs, which, by the way, is completely dried up now, or largely dried up now. But in that first year, there's enormous increase in financial resources available to support people seeking abortions, including these folks. And telehealth was dramatically expanding. So telehealth access to abortion, by which I mean direct-to-patient telehealth. The patient doesn't ever have to travel physically to a brick-and-mortar facility. They can interact with a clinician through text or video call, and then abortion pills are mailed to them. That's what I'm talking about. Telehealth was already expanding before Dobbs. So the FDA had, during COVID, issued an emergency order that temporarily relaxed its regulations around the distribution of abortion medications. It allowed an increase in telehealth, but not all states, this is very key, allow telehealth abortion to happen. But states like New York, states like California that are protective of abortion rights did. And telehealth was expanding. And then Dobbs, almost paradoxically, accelerated that. Everybody was paying attention to it. More providers are coming online. The costs, the prices they're charging for telehealth abortion are going down. And we can see that there's this really large rise in telehealth abortions. So the national rise is really driven by the fact that in states that protected abortion access actually expanded for a lot of people. And there were people in those states, like, you could be living in rural New York, like not near a brick and mortar facility or have limited financial resources. And all of a sudden you've got more options available to you. So I think that's one thing, is that the national increase is driven by protected states. And the second thing I'll point to is that for residents of states that banned abortion, first of all, about, as best I can tell in the data from my own analyses, about 75 to 80% of people who wanted abortions in those states found a way to travel to another state to get the abortion right after Dobbs. And then as Shield Law started coming online, it made it easier and easier for them to, instead of driving, order the pills through the mail and get them shipped to their state. And for those two reasons, it's not like the bans trap everybody in banned states. They actually don't trap most people in banned states. Most of them figure it out. Now, it's not to say they don't incur really large costs that they wouldn't have had to incur before. And these are poor populations, right? So they might be struggling to figure out how to pull together the resources, take off of work, get childcare, travel. Like, I'm not saying it's easy, but most of them are figuring it out. And so the abortion rates for residents of banned states didn't fall as much as some people might have expected.
So North Carolina is one of the states last year that received the second most travelers. So 16,000 people traveled to North Carolina for care. So we're seeing people come to North Carolina. But Jonas and I also travel to Virginia to provide care. So we see people who are further along in gestation that travel to Virginia for care. And so, the circumstances are extremely chaotic for these folks. They'll have a friend, multiple kids in their car, traveling from as far as like Miami. I mean, I frequently care for patients who have driven all the way from Miami to Virginia, just driving through the night to get there kind of thing. And people are resourceful and figure out a way. And I think there are still some donations out there for people to make it. But we're sort of like in the middle of this like chaotic scene. And I always think about the people who so sometimes people make it and they may have some sort of medical complication that we can't care for them in an outpatient setting. So we have to send them back home. And I think about those patients, and I think about the people that just couldn't get the resources together to make it out, to get to us.
Right. And I can see them in the data. It's interesting having a conversation, and it's really helpful for me. I think I see the things that I can count in vital statistics data, right? I can count abortions. I can count births. I can count economic outcomes. I can count various social outcomes. But I don't get to talk to the people who are experiencing all of the complex circumstances that lead to something. I'll count just like, did they get an abortion or not? As though there isn't a whole host of other outcomes and questions that are really important to the people who are traveling. And so, with respect to the people who don't make it, they're there. We can see them in the births data really, really clearly. And we can see in particular that at least for the first year after Dobbs, which is really before, telehealth is definitely available to people in banned states, but it became much more available later. So these are kind of the early days, but what we can see in the data suggests that about 1 in 5 people who wanted an abortion weren't figuring out a way to get one. And these people were disproportionately likely to be kind of among the lowest income, the most economically vulnerable populations. Like, that's part of why they couldn't get out, right? That's part of why they couldn't figure out how to travel. And so we do see them in the data, and we're following, like, now that more data are becoming available, there's more people doing research on what happens next, and we're starting to see outcomes like increases in infant morbidity, increases in maternal morbidity and mortality. We're seeing increases in intimate partner violence rates. We're seeing increases in child maltreatment rates. Stay tuned. I have a paper we're wrapping up right now that looks at financial instability and property crimes. Like, you can kind of think of all these subsequent effects for poor marginalized families that are being kind of experiencing a destabilizing event. Also, even the families who do scrape together the resources and travel, those families can also contribute to a lot of these outcomes, because it's, for instance, a woman who's living at risk of intimate partner violence might have to reveal more about her decision that she would otherwise, that can increase her risks. People are at risk of losing their job because they have to take time off to travel, and then that can be very destabilizing. And so it's not like just because somebody did or didn't get an abortion, that's the sole thing that drives these outcomes. Like, it's creating a host of outcomes for people who are seeking abortions.
Can you talk a little bit about the effects on the birth rate? I mean, some of your work that was pre-Dobbs, I think, predicted around a 3% change in the birth rate as a result of banning abortion. Is that right?
And that's about what we're seeing. So, I'll say, let me back up and talk about that a little. So pre-Dobbs, I forecast a roughly 3% increase in the birth rate in the banned states. I want to be really clear that I'm conditioning that on, like, being in a place that's affected, not nationwide, but like in a place that's affected. And the way I created that forecast was by looking at how people responded to the closures of facilities before Dobbs. So I had more than a decade's worth of data on abortion facility operations before Dobbs, and I had county level birth rates. And so what I could do over time is basically track, if you have somebody, let's say, who's in Harris County, Texas, which is the Houston area before Dobbs, they didn't have a major shock to distance. And any trends in their birth rates before Dobbs were just due to all the other things that affect fertility, right? There's lots of other stuff. But then we have a comparable county in Texas. Let's say, let's move down to Corpus Christi, Texas, where the provider closed in 2014 and never reopened. And that was because of another Texas regulation. So they were basically forced to close. And so they have, in Corpus Christi, a really big increase in distance.
And you're talking about the distance that a patient would need to travel to get to a provider to get abortion care.
Yes, in a time and a place where telehealth in the formal U.S. healthcare system is not an option. So this distance to these brick and mortar facilities really matters. There are tons of natural experiments like that, situations where one city's getting shocked and one city isn't. And I'm basically using all of those natural experiments for this more than a decade leading up to Dobbs to answer the question, if distance goes up by X amount, how many people give birth as a result? Right? Let me figure out, and that, for me, I'm saying how many people end up not getting an abortion and giving birth, right? I can see them give birth in the birth certificate data. And so for more than a decade leading up to Dobbs, we could see that if distance went from up by like maybe 100 miles, that could easily stop about 1 in 5 people who wanted abortions from getting them. And actually, it's that first 100 miles that matters hugely. The next 100 doesn't matter to somebody who already can't get there. Right? Like, if you already can't get to Houston from Corpus Christi, it doesn't really matter if the nearest provider then becomes Kansas City. You still can't get there. Might as well be on the moon, right? Those initial increases really trap the most people. So I used that data to say, okay, we have a pretty good idea if Dobbs happens, which states are going to ban abortion. I'll just do a thought experiment where I close all of their abortion facilities. I send everybody to the next nearest one that I think still remains open. And I estimate how many people can't get there. And based on that, I estimated this increase in births. And, it's kind of a bold thing to make a forecast that people are going to be able to test not very long afterwards. And we have tested it. Other researchers have tested it. I've tested it in new and ongoing work. And it holds up pretty well. The effect is a bit smaller than I forecast. It's probably a bit smaller than I forecast because of the shield laws coming online. But still, the estimates we're getting suggest about a 2.3 to 2.8% increase in births. And maybe that sounds small to people, right? Like, I'm a data person and I study births a lot. And I'm like, holy moly, a 2 to 3% increase in births. That's a big shock for people who work in births data. But if that doesn't sound like a big shock to you, let me kind of back that out and say, look, Most people who get pregnant aren't seeking an abortion to begin with. They're not affected. Of the people who are seeking an abortion, most of them are still going to find a way to travel. To see a 2 to 3% increase in births suggests that about anywhere from a fifth to maybe a third of people who want abortions, that'd be kind of my confidence interval, aren't finding a way to get one. That means, like, of this affected population, people who want abortions, a very significant minority of them are getting trapped by the bans. So that 2 to 3%, that's a big number.
Well, and I think if we connect these numbers to the turnaway study and knowing what happens to people who are turned away from care, I almost think of the people who are unable to even make it to care, to even be turned away, or even in a higher risk group. Like you talked about, being a more vulnerable group of people. And so it's increasing the suffering for this group of people that already has tremendous challenges in their lives, and potentially increasing the risk of death.
Yes, absolutely. Of course. I mean, it's increasing the risk of death for the pregnant person. Of course. Like, I'll say, first of all, just mechanically, it is very well established that carrying a pregnancy to delivery carries significantly higher health risks than obtaining an abortion within the U.S. healthcare system, right? So just mechanically, it's riskier to carry the pregnancy to delivery. And also, the people who are trapped are overwhelmingly from populations that face much higher rates of maternal morbidity and mortality. Like, their risks are much higher than the general population. And so, we're seeing it in the data, and it's kind of like, of course we're seeing it in the data. We knew we would see this in the data, and it's there.
Yeah, and it's especially impactful too if you then sort of add on what you mentioned before about the fact that once they get the abortion, even if you are able to travel and get the abortion, that's not the end of the story, right? Because people are suffering all sorts of economic consequences, for example, as a result of having to travel, having to leave work, having to find childcare, all of that increased burden to access care. So, of that, like, let's say you have 5 people who are seeking abortion care, one of them's not going to be able to get it. And maybe, right, based on like 3 of the remaining 5 are going to suffer serious economic consequences that they really can't afford, even if they were able to access care.
Right. And I think that's where, in so many ways, I think that this debate I've found frustrating in terms of just not acknowledging often enough in the public discourse that the populations who are trapped by abortion policy aren't everybody. They're not the general population. And I think that we want to, this is an inequality story. It's absolutely an inequality story. And I'll say, in economic circles, I've been presenting on abortion for decades now, and this happens less, but it used to be, like, say 20 years ago, that I would present on the effects of abortion policy on abortion and birth rates. And that economists who were kind of accustomed to thinking in very standard economic frameworks would say, this is completely irrational. What are you talking about? We know that carrying a pregnancy to delivery carries enormous kind of economic consequences for women. For instance, their earnings fall off a cliff after they become mothers. Our earnings fall by about 30% after we become mothers, and they don't recover quickly, and they never fully recover. So if somebody doesn't wish to carry a severely mistimed or unwanted pregnancy to term, the costs they might be thinking about might be even higher than that. And they're trying to figure out how to travel 50 miles. Like, my gosh, of course they're going to travel 50 miles.
Thinking about rural people in the U.S. now, and thinking about their access to just pregnancy care in general and access to abortion care, like, that is a group of people that struggles to get out of their rural area for any type of health care. And with less access to good OBGYN care, may have higher risk in pregnancy. I think that's something that we're seeing definitely in North Carolina as more rural hospitals are closing.
Yeah, and I think that is such a complicated interplay, right? Like, in our current moment, the closure of rural hospitals is impacting all sorts of health outcomes. But when you think about obstetrical care and delivery, I mean, particularly that, right? Like, what do you do when the hospital is so much further away? What do you do if it's winter and the roads are bad, right? So, like, yes. And now we have a situation where the ability to decide whether and when to carry a pregnancy to term has been constrained. And so I think there's likely to be an interplay. And it's interesting that you say this because I always get research questions just from talking to people who are actually on the ground seeing patients. And I'm like, has anybody used data to look at this? I will scribble it down.
Okay.
Well, I also wonder whether rural populations, and this probably does exist, and I haven't looked at it, but I mean, are they able to, telemedicine abortion is, you have to know about telemedicine abortion. You have to have a community that hears about it. And if you are in a rural community with less health education in general,
or less internet access.
Yeah, then is your access to that particular information also constrained?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some really good work coming from several researchers looking at kind of the determinants of who is accessing telehealth abortion and who isn't. And I want to just kind of preface this by saying I think it's all changing. Like Dobbs, an unintended consequence of Dobbs is that the American public has become much more aware of medication abortion and much more aware of telehealth provision of medication abortion than I think they would have been without Dobbs. All of a sudden, we were all talking about it. As best I can tell from looking at the data and the trends and effects on births after Dobbs, at least initially after Dobbs, as we see more and more people in banned states turning to telehealth, many of them are actually substituting travel for telehealth. So it's allowing them to avoid what could be some really tremendous cost of traveling. But it doesn't seem to have initially been reaching a whole lot of people who just weren't going to be able to travel. Like those people who got trapped by distance didn't seem to be finding telehealth initially either. But we're doing some new analyses with new data that just got released by the CDC in like about a week ago. And so we're updating that analysis. And the only thing I'm willing to say in preview, because I'm like, once we get off of this, I'll keep running my regressions, is I think that continued to evolve and telehealth began reaching more and more people in late 2023 into 2024. Like I think that shifted some. But it's telehealth doesn't reach everybody. Everybody's not a candidate for it, first of all, right? Not everybody.
Yeah. I wonder what people think about receiving medicine in the mail, too, if you live in a rural area. I mean, my mom was a postmaster in our rural county for many years, and she also has like she remembers numbers and like crazy things. I could be like, well, whose post office box is da-da-da? And she would know whose post office box that was. And so like, I wonder, like everyone is everybody's business in like a rural town. And so I wonder if there's some hesitancy around ordering something online.
Oh yeah. I think privacy is a real issue. And there are privacy issues that patients face both when they're traveling and when they're ordering the medication, right? So if you're ordering it, you've got to find a way. If you're trying to maintain privacy, you've got to think about your browser history, right? You got to think about your search history. You have got to think about emails and calls that you might receive. And then you think about the mail that you might receive. And then you think about, the fact that you're going to be going through the process of a medication abortion at home, and you may or may not be comfortable with telling that to people around you. That's one of the reasons some people say that they would prefer to drive and have it kind of, quote, over with, right? Like, not that I'm saying, I know y'all can complicate that real quick, but I'll just say air quotes over with. But driving also means you might have to, borrow a car, tell people why you're gone for a while, either way. I think both options for many people involve some loss of privacy relative to having a brick and mortar facility in their town or near their town.
I am curious what you think is on the horizon, not from a political standpoint, but what do you think is coming? I mean, where do you think things are going to settle out in terms of access to abortion? Do you think people are going to get used to travel, used to telehealth? Do you think the situation's going to get worse? When you look to the future, what do you see?
I know I just told you about making a forecast for Dobbs, but man, I'm not usually in the forecasting business. But let me tell you what I'm watching very, very carefully. Right now, we're in a delicate equilibrium of sorts. Like, I think that in this moment, the landscape of bans hasn't been shifting and flickering like it was in the first year after Dobbs. I'm not saying we couldn't get more, couldn't get less, but I think it's much more stable than it was in the first year after Dobbs. And we were kind of trying to figure out which states were going to enforce bans and which ones weren't. And if there was no change in policy in the next 5 years, I would say it might stay about like that. But I'd kind of be surprised if there was no change in policy and the places to look, which are related to each other. The first one is, what is the future of shield laws?
So there's a ton in the news about shield laws, but what exactly is a shield law and why is it important for provision of care?
What these shield laws allow is for providers to care for patients who are out of the state that they're in and where they may not have a medical license under the laws that govern the state in which the doctor is sitting. So if I'm a doctor sitting in Massachusetts, then I can provide care to a patient in any state under the laws of Massachusetts, and my state will help protect me from having to face charges about practicing medicine outside of my license or committing a crime in some other state.
The bottom line is shield laws are trying to protect doctors who are providing care to patients who are desperate for it. And if the way that care is provided changes in a way that makes it impossible to provide care outside of your state, then that could cut off telehealth abortion for many, many people.
Yeah, but if we're going to boil it down even more from our bros out there, what we're going to say is shield laws good, abortion bans bad.
Yeah.
So Caitlin goes on to talk about her second point, which is about the possibility of changing regulation of mifepristone.
Suppose the FDA actually rolled it all the way back in some way, shape, or form and said, look, the approval's moot. We approved it 20-some years ago, despite all the evidence of the ensuing 20 years that it's safe and effective. It's in some way unapproved, like through some sort of policy from the FDA, or there's some other ways it could happen. More than 60% of abortions are provided with mifepristone. Obviously, all the telehealth abortions are provided with it. Now, the providers could go to a misoprostol-only regime, but it's not clear how many of them would. I think a lot would, but it's not clear that all of them would. And a ton of the brick and mortar facilities in this country only provide medication abortion. They don't provide procedural abortion. We do not have the capacity, if there's a major shock to medication abortion provision, to just substitute everybody over to procedural abortions. It's so clear in the data that there's not the capacity in terms of the staff, in terms of the facilities for that. And so those are the things that I'm watching. Could there be a shock to the provision of medication abortion via mifepristone regulation? Could there be a shock to kind of the operation of shield laws would be the big ones. And I don't think the public understands, when you say mifepristone regulation, that is just not something that I think your average person on the street is like, oh yeah, I get why that's a really big deal.
Right. Well, and I think part of our job and part of the job on this podcast is to really help people understand how safe mifepristone is. And if we were to shift to a misoprostol-only, regimen of medication, it would mean more side effects for people. Oh
yeah.
And that's the thing. These laws create so much more suffering. It's suffering all around. And I think when you were talking in the beginning about how, we wouldn't conduct a randomized control trial that was unethical, this is a natural experiment that's totally unethical. Every part of Dobbs is unethical in my mind.
It's interesting. I was sitting at a plenary session at a meeting at the Society of Family Planning, and it's probably fall of 2022. It was shortly after Dobbs. And people were talking about statistical analyses. I mean, it was very nerdy, very social scientists talking about how to count things, basically, right? But it was a big room. It was a very full room, and probably 150 people. And somebody makes this kind of offhanded comment. You know who's happy about this? The economists are happy about this. They're like, look, here's a natural experiment we could exploit. And I was like, oh, I'm sinking down into my chair and thinking, I absolutely think about the ethics, the ethical implications of all the work I do, where the data come from, the types of analyses I run, the way I communicate it. It is crucial. And also, when the natural experiment has happened, whatever we think, and we probably are somewhat aligned on this, but whatever we think about, whether it should have happened, like, I'm definitely going to look at the data, right? I'm definitely going to dive in there and count the outcomes. We've got to know the effects of our policies. One of the things that's really dismayed me is that I didn't come to this area of research because I had really strong political priors. In fact, I'm very ambivalent about the ethics of abortion. As many people lots of people will tell you. They have hesitations, they have questions, they think it's complicated. Lots of people will say that. And I'm definitely among them. And what's been so dismaying to me is how glib some of the political conversations seem to be, as though like it's just obvious what the policy should be. It's just obvious what the regulation should be. It's just obvious that like this is wrong and this is right, as though life isn't incredibly complex, as though human bodies aren't incredibly complex, as though all of these decisions aren't. Like, I just think, if nothing else, I understand how reasonable people can disagree. I'm from a family that has lots of conservative people in it who disagree with me, and like I love them and they love me. I understand that reasonable people can disagree, but reasonable people should be able to have a conversation about the evidence. And that failure, that repeated failure that I've seen around Dobbs has just been really dismaying.
We asked Caitlin about a time that she can think of when she changed her mind. It's
interesting. I love that phrase, strong opinions loosely held. I always like to think of myself fundamentally as a scientist. And I think that if one fancies themselves a scientist, then part of that is having to always be open to having your mind changed, right? Like, one of the things that we do is say, I'll always take new evidence. I'll always take a new argument. I will always reevaluate this thing. Like, science is not certain. That's not a feature of it, right? It's the feature of it is the method, and that we get closer and closer to truth and understanding why it is that, we believe what we believe. So I think there's like a million small examples of new evidence that's shifted my mind. And then also, as the parent of 4 teenagers, 40 cajillion examples of conversation with my kids where they've convinced me that I might be a little bit wrong. I'm thinking of one thing in particular. It's during the COVID pandemic. So during the COVID pandemic, of course, it's such a shock. It's so scary. Things are shutting down, and, parents are facing their own particular set of challenges. And mine was that my kids were in middle school and high school, and all of a sudden they're being sent home during this like very crucial developmental period in adolescence. One of them in particular is very social, was suffering hugely from the isolation. And at the time, I honestly felt like the policies were the right policies, that closing the schools was absolutely the right policy. It was what we had to do. It was what we had to do as a society. And it's, absolutely the case that my husband and I made to the kids over and over again. Like, we have an obligation to protect the vulnerable members of our society. That is what we're doing. And of course, the schools eventually reopened and our kids eventually went back. But as a parent and teacher, I think I'm among the many people who feel like we're seeing the long-term effects of those closures on a young generation. And I got to tell you, and this is a hindsight's 2020 kind of deal, but with hindsight, I'm not sure I agreed with those policies. I got to be honest. I look back and I'm like, I'm not sure about that trade-off. And I've talked to people who tend to have a much more, tend to have attitudes towards pandemic policy that are more common among kind of conservative groups. And I talk to them and I tend to be swayed by it. And I tend to think, with hindsight, maybe we could have done that differently.
Related to abortion, I think as I've been providing this care for years and years, how I care for my patients and how I see their perspectives it's changed over time, like how I view the care I provide. And a lot of that is just by seeing other people's experiences in their lives and all of the struggles they bring into the encounter. And a lot of time, because there's so much stigma around abortion, people aren't opening themselves up to the world with those stories necessarily. I feel like that is one post-Dobbs thing that has happened, is that people are sharing more and more stories. But when you see the perspective of people that are just struggling to get by and really find themselves in a situation where they need help, it's hard not to help them.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect?
I've heard of it, but if you were to ask...
Is this part of our quiz?
So it's this psychological phenomenon. I should know the origins. I'm sure it comes from people named Dunning and Kruger, I would guess. Yes. But basically the idea is that the less you know about something, the more confident you are. And as you learn more about the thing, you become less confident about like your state of knowledge. I think about that a lot when I talk to students about learning. And I say, look, learning in class is this inherently uncomfortable process because you start to learn just enough to realize how much you don't know. And then you're like, right? And you become very anxious. But I think about this also when I talk to people about abortion, where I'm like, man, it's easy to have a strongly held opinion on what people should do when you don't know very much about the circumstances that they're in. And the more you learn about the complexities of the kind of health and economic challenges that people are facing, I think the harder it is to have a very strongly held opinion on exactly what you think they must do.
This podcast is executive produced by us, Dr. Bev Gray, Dr. Jonah Swartz, and Jane Marie. Production by Little Everywhere. Thanks to Nick Thorburn, Patrick Ford, and Maker for our score. Extra special thanks to Caitlin Myers, who lent her knowledge and expertise to this episode.
Opinions expressed on this podcast are our own. Philanthropy keeps this podcast ad-free. To donate, you can find a link in the show notes.